Now, when I accepted this invitation, I wanted to try and find some angle that might appeal to a fairly broad audience. So it's a rather experimental presentation. And I've chosen as my title, Learning by Doing, partly because I regard myself as taking part in a never-ending process of learning in relation to refugee history in particular, and the conversations and the occasions such as this from which I continue to learn. But I also wanted to connect that more personal perspective with an argument about the dynamic learning process that's associated with the emergence of a refugee regime, the key actors of which include states, intergovernmental organizations and non-governmental organizations. But then I also wanted to do something else as a third element of this presentation, and that's to think about the learning process, if I can call it that, that takes place amongst refugees. And this is a way, I hope, of drawing attention to their experiences, the observations they make, the kinds of encounters they have with different actors in the refugee regime, and also the outcomes. And I'm conscious that these are questions that, in my view at least, need to be carefully contextualized. So I'm going to try and be careful not to overgeneralize where possible. But I also want to suggest that learning by doing is something that appeals to me as a way of thinking about these issues in a kind of non-mechanical or non-mechanistic fashion. So I'm going to begin with some personal reflections, partly because, as Jan says, I've just retired. At least I've retired from teaching and administration. So it seems to be an appropriate moment in which to sort of embark on a few more personal reflections. So that's where I shall begin. And with apologies to anyone who thinks this is going to be purely narcissistic on my part. There's an element of narcissism, but I hope it doesn't come across too strongly. So as Jan says, my background has been originally in Russian history, and particularly around the era of the First World War. And about 25 years ago, so kind of midway through my career, or not quite, I had the advantage of 2 years research funding to write what was going to be a book on the economic and social history of Russia during the First World War, which I did eventually write. But as I began to think about this subject, I quickly became aware of a profoundly significant manifestation or problem, if you will, that had so far eluded the attention of scholars. And that is to do with the magnitude and the political repercussions of the mass displacement of civilians in the Russian Empire during the First World War. And this was a topic that had been badly neglected since the revolution of 1917. We heard in earlier papers in this seminar series about the way in which myths can easily become constructed around episodes of displacement. And of course, in Russia, the great foundational myth of the Soviet Union was the victory of the proletariat and the poor peasantry under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. And all that kind of effaced or meant the complete neglect of the refugee situation in Russia. So there was a kind of interest and an intriguing set of questions about who were these people, what happened to them, and what were the repercussions for Russia, as well as questions about why they evaporated from public consciousness. But of course, then, like any historian, one was not just thinking about what sources might be available to write this history, but also what are the kind of methodological insights or issues that needed to be addressed. And it was quickly apparent to me that, in one sense, that the methodologies that I wanted to adopt would derive from refugee studies, which was beginning from the late 1980s to become an established field through institutions and journals and so forth. And it's very much this kind of interdisciplinary literature that I found immensely inspiring. Much of it in English, some of it in French and German, languages that I managed to read, but was largely, I think, derived from the work of anthropologists. I'm thinking of classic studies by people like René Hirschon, who wrote about the Greek-Turkish population exchange. I'm thinking about Peter Loizos, who wrote wonderful work about Cyprus after 1974, and perhaps most prominently the work of the American anthropologist Lisa Malky. But amongst this anthropological literature, I was also struck by work by human geographers, thinking of Jennifer Hindman, political scientists, perhaps above all Aristide Zolberg, and then by what might more broadly be called cultural studies. I'm thinking of work on representations of refugees that go back at least as far as Roland Barthes, but include more recently work by people such as Terence Wright. So there was a lot of exciting reading, background reading, if you like, to be done. And now, 25 years later, I find it very difficult to disentangle these different threads in my mind. So that methodologically, there was a kind of big, significant foundation of work on which to draw. But methodologically, in the second place, it seemed to me that there was a key that could also be unlocked by contemporary Russian studies of the refugee crisis. And that goes back to what Jan mentioned in his introduction, the concept of refugeedom, which is my translation, or at least I thought it was my translation of a Russian term, bеженство, but I have found it propping up in one or two other places since. So I can't copyright that term. I don't own it. But the concept, it seemed, and this is why the methodological point is important, is that it seemed to characterize not just issues of scale or magnitude or statistics, as we were discussing earlier on today, but how it was understood by contemporaries, how it was conceptualized as having a profound impact on the social order. In other words, in talking about refugees and refugeedom, contemporaries in the First World War were saying to themselves, well, there was an established social structure, the traditional social structure of Tsarist Russia, organized according to different estates. And that contends with an emerging transformation of society, which has to do with the emergence of class, of social class. And contemporaries said, well, you have estates or you have classes, but what are we to do with refugees? Where do they fit in to this kind of social order, either one that's traditional or one that's still to be born, so to speak? And thinking about what was at stake here was a series of debates that engaged both supporters of the old regime, Tsarist state, and also its detractors. Everybody was engaged in this debate about what the significance of refugeedom was. And it also became inflected not only by considerations of age and of gender, but also very significantly of ethnicity. So differentiating refugees in this time period became one of beginning to disaggregate, if you like, according to ethnicity. Refugees who were Jewish, refugees who were Polish, refugees who were Lithuanian, and so on and so forth. And that mattered partly because it eventually contributed to a kind of subversive politics, but also because it mobilized refugees in particular forms of association and education and so on and so forth. So there then became a kind of, and this is part of the learning process, a realization that there was stuff in the sense of source material. And I'd struggled in previous research projects with trying to get into Soviet archives. But of course, by the late 1990s, that was much less of an issue. So I thought, like a kind of child in a sweet shop, let me into the archives and see what I can find. And of course, I did find a great deal, but it was also a process of learning that not everything is in the archives, that because of the kind of politicization of this, you found a lot of material in newspapers and journals, as well as in what we might now call grey literature. So illuminating different perspectives and the kind of apparatus of control and assistance and supervision and so on and so forth. And indeed, artifacts too. There was an initiative in 1917, or the winter of 1916 to 17, you could hardly choose a worse time, to collect memorabilia and material objects from refugees, bearing in mind that there's something like 6 or 7 million of these people in the Russian Empire, far more than there were workers, to collect material objects to kind of create a foundation for the historian in years to come. And unfortunately, I've never been able to locate this collection of material, assuming it still exists in St. Petersburg. I think it probably does. So immense amount of sources and enormous kind of satisfaction in trying to work out what this all amounted to. So I don't want to go into too much more about this particular bit of biography or historiography, if you like, except to say that it was foundational in my career terms, because it meant new avenues to explore what happened next, the obvious historian's question, but also incredibly significant, and Jan also mentioned this in his introduction, the importance of collaboration. And I think, amongst the lessons I have learned over my career, it's that conversations and collaborations are simply a wonderful way of keeping one's brain active, but of actually being able to pick other people's brains and see how they think and how they approach the subject themselves. And without going into too much more of a career perspective, one of the important things to me was being able to teach the subject to several generations of undergraduates at Manchester. I decided I was going to abandon my courses on Russian economic history and the history of the Russian Revolution, which I quite enjoyed teaching, and instead to teach a course on refugee history. And that started in about 2000, I think. And I call it Refugees in Modern World History because I was determined that my students would not go away graduating with the assumption that refugees were something that happened in Central Europe in the 1930s or Europe in the aftermath of the breakup of Yugoslavia. I wanted it to be global. I mean, it was it wasn't exactly a fantasy. It was probably unrealistic, but I was determined to adopt that kind of panoramic perspective, even if it meant the loss of some kind of specificity. And then I think the final point I wanted to make about me learning by doing, apart from the kind of things that I haven't done, I've not done anything really in the way of oral history, very little. Things that I can't do because I don't read non-European languages, much to my regret. I wish I'd learned Arabic or Bengali or Mandarin Chinese, but I haven't. But the other crucial thing I think is important is that the process of teaching and the process of writing is a kind of craft in my view, and one reads almost everything now, at least I do, whether it's a piece of prose in a newspaper or even a tweet or watching a film, attending to the way in which people express themselves and trying to find examples of clear prose, not just precise, but clarity. I think I'm much more attentive to the words on the page than I would have been at the start of my career. Well, now, assuming you've not given up on me for talking so much about me, I wanted to turn to the second of the part of the talk, and here I want to talk about learning by doing as it applies to actors within the refugee regime. And I, of course, can't do everything, so I'm going to omit any discussion of the state or of non-governmental organizations or aid workers. We can discuss this afterwards if you wish. Suffice it to say that I think there's a good history to be written about aid work or aid workers and how they learn on the job. I don't think that history has yet been fully understood or written about. Or we could talk about the constitution of expertise. We're going to hear about this later on in the seminar series, but the way in which social workers or psychologists or teachers and other kinds of experts constitute themselves and learn by doing. What I wanted to do instead was to look at the specific context of the post-1945 world and the actions of UNHCR, and to some extent its antecedent organization, so UNHCR, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the IRO, which is the International Refugee Organization, which immediately preceded it. And I've become, in the last few years, particularly interested in the actions of UNHCR officials as they operate in accordance with the High Commissioner's mandate and the principles laid down in the 1951 United Nations Refugee Convention. So this significant document, still in existence, notwithstanding the efforts of some people to tear it up, was foundational in the sense that it specified the criteria for recognizing who was a refugee and by extension who was not. Criteria that had to do with the well-founded fear of persecution on various grounds that were enumerated, and which also specified that a refugee had to have crossed an international frontier, in the language of the time, was outside the country of his nationality, and who was also unable or unwilling to return to that country of nationality. And as most people, I guess, in this room will know, the convention was designed specifically to apply to events in Europe prior to the 1st of January 1951. So it was a very significant intervention. It was exclusionary as much as it was inclusive. But from my point of view, what it did was to land officials, in the IRO and UNHCR with the job of determining eligibility or who qualified as a refugee and who did not qualify for recognition. In other words, who was presenting but was not deemed to be outside the country of nationality, or who could not claim make a valid claim for being persecuted. So I begin to think of this as a kind of encounter between the officials, eligibility officers, about what more in a moment, and refugees who presented themselves, making a claim. So this seemed to me to be open up questions about a learning process taking place. And the learning process was partly, I, as the eligibility officer, will study the documentation, but I will also interrogate, if you like, the person who's making such a claim. But of course, I think it's also important to add that the procedure was supplemented by informal conversations that took place and are not documented. So you have a record of the encounter between refugees and eligibility officers, but what you don't have is the record of the kind of water cooler conversation or the corridor conversation that took place between different officials, one to the other. So you've got an encounter, as I see it, between an individual eligibility officer and an individual refugee. And this is a specific kind of encounter, it seems to me. It's different. If one were talking about learning by doing, for example, before 1945, the League of Nations, as I understand it, we would want to think of this as a different kind of encounter. Clearly, refugees wrote or petitioned the League of Nations saying, "This is who I am, how can you help me?" But the idea of a kind of intimate encounter in an office, for example, is something much more particular to the post-45 era, it seems to me, than to the interwar period. And whilst I'm on that subject, just recently, in the last 3 or 4 days, I was reading a remarkable short account in the Guardian newspaper by a British Home Office asylum claims decision maker. It's available online if you go to the Guardian for the 8th of October, and it's entitled, "From the Inside, I've Seen the Home Office Fail Refugees." And I was very struck. I mean, I was kind of in some ways mortified, in some ways not particularly surprised by what this person had to say. And this is what he says. "At the decision stage, we had the task of picking through mountains of complex and arcane case law and guidance. Home Office asylum decision makers require no formal legal education beyond training received on the job. In the first few weeks, our trainers told us matter-of-factly we would be expected to produce more refusals than grants, one of the criteria on which managers would judge our success." So we've got, as it were, a kind of 2021 perspective, albeit from the UK Home Office, or anti-Home Office, as I like to think of it, in which decisions were being made in a very rushed fashion. And because they were rushed, they were often then appealed. But the appeal process itself could be very protracted. Contrast that with something that's much more procedurally, might one say elaborate, I'm not sure, which is the document that was prepared for office use only by the IRO in 1947. And this is called the Manual for Eligibility Officers. So this is a 160-page document with additional annotations. So the context here is the aftermath of the Second World War. The context is one in which refugees and displaced persons, i.e. the forced laborers who were taken by the Nazi war economy to work in Germany or occupied Europe from their homes in, not exclusively, but mainly in Eastern Europe. And the debates were, are these people to be repatriated? And what happens if they don't wish to be repatriated? Can this person be recognized as a refugee or a displaced person? And if the applicant expressed an objection to being repatriated to his or her home, which in many cases was now under communist control, their home, in other words, had changed. If they had an objection to being repatriated, they should submit to the following test as laid down in the eligibility manual. He must definitely, this is underlined, definitely, and in complete freedom, underlined, and after receiving adequate information, underlined, express valid objections, underlined, against returning to his country of nationality or former habitual residence. So there is a kind of prescribed test of eligibility. And the result of that inquiry, according to the eligibility manual, must be kept under continuous review until the case ceases to be of concern. So the onus was essentially on the individual applicant to demonstrate to an officer that he or she was entitled to this recognition as a refugee. And the manual is quite interesting because it goes on to say, quote, this must be a cooperative venture between him and the organization. So the manual suggests that this is a partnership, it's a conversation, it's a cooperative venture. But of course, in reality, as the document goes on to say, the eligibility officer was seeking to establish whether the person concerned was telling what was, quote, a plausible story, particularly where the documentation had gone missing for one reason or another. So this, I'm going to round up on this manual in a moment, but it seems to me that it's a significant source because it establishes a process that's supposed to be followed. And in its annotations, it describes individual cases, anonymized, but gives the person's initials and his or her date of birth as to why this person was eligible or was not eligible. And often it was a case that this person passed him or herself off as something other than what they were. So German expellees, the Volksdeutsche and the Vertriebenen from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania would not be eligible because they'd been expelled to a country of nationality. And just to add to this, the manual was inherited by UNHCR. UNHCR updated it in 1962, and then again in 1979, again in 1992 and 2011. And at some stage, I'd like to sort of follow up these different editions. But the crucial point is that the emphasis upon interrogation and establishing the claim of an individual resulted in the creation of and preservation of something like 25 or 30,000 individual case files that are preserved in UNHCR records and archives. And that covers the period from 51 to 75. In 1975, UNHCR changed its classification process or rules because it decided that there were far more refugees, particularly in Southeast Asia, and it no longer organized its files alphabetically by name, which is how they exist at the moment, but instead started to organize them by country of origin or country of resettlement. But nevertheless, 25,000 plus case files covering a quarter century from 51 to 75 is an enormous resource in which one can see how UNHCR learned by doing. I don't think I've got time to talk about who the UNHCR officials were, but the important point I want to make is that when this body of material was first created in the early 1950s, the main kinds of cases that were coming to the attention of UNHCR were European, in accordance with the High Commissioner's mandate, in accordance with the convention. And that meant that you could have people writing in from China, but they were Russians who'd left in 1917 and who were writing as middle-aged or elderly in the 1950s. And you would also find, of course, East Europeans, Romanians, Albanians, Hungarians, and others who made up a significant proportion of the case files. But what was striking to me as I started to go through these case files is the way in which the profile begins to change. And so by the 1960s, and certainly by the early 1970s, UNHCR is learning that there are refugees in other parts of the world who are knocking on the door. And by that, I don't mean primarily Palestinian refugees, because they come within the aegis of a different UN organization, the Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees. There are no Korean refugees, unless they happen to be European in origin, because Korean refugees, again, came under a different UN organization. But what does happen is that you begin to get larger and larger numbers of refugees from sub-Saharan Africa, figure in the case files from Sudan, Congo, and other parts of particularly East Central Africa. So let me, in the third part, turn to what one might call refugees' perspectives, learning by doing. And here, of course, you won't be surprised to learn that the overwhelming profile and the perspective that you find in the 1950s was of refugees who wanted to assert a claim for protection or assistance because they were persecuted by communist states. So an awful lot of these are what one might call stories of loss, of persecution, couched often in very kind of supplicatory terms. Sometimes, of course, people speaking about desperate loss of family, a loss of material resources. But they're also, and here I want to try and say something about learning by doing, not just articulating cases of anti-communism, but as the files progress chronologically, of refugees whose applications adopt other kinds of tactics. And they include examples where refugees are casting aspersions, are casting a kind of contemptuous glance at other refugees. I'll give you one example. This is from 1969, so the end, more or less, of the time period. And this is a Congolese refugee who fled to Kampala, Uganda in 1964. And he was contacting UNHCR Geneva in 1969, and he wrote a succession of letters. And that too is important. You know, refugees were very often not content with, you know, one letter, one brush off or refusal, but go back and back to UNHCR. And this man protested in one of his letters that he was a good employer of people in Kampala. Quote, "Unlike shameless adventurers, liars, and even bandits who petition and deceive you by using false names and submitting false invoices and prescriptions written with the collusion of Indian doctors, So here is someone who is adopting a particular kind of tone. It's both an appeal for assistance, but it's couched in a kind of rhetorical manner that in which he wants to distinguish himself as a kind of upright citizen from all the other phony or even criminal refugees who he finds himself in the midst of. And he writes more and more to UNHCR saying, why are you not giving me proper financial assistance? Eventually, UNHCR manages to help him, and he returns to Congo, Kinshasa. And it may be here that the kind of tactics that he adopted helped him. It's difficult to say. Quite often with these case files, the trail goes cold. What I think is important to say by way of parenthesis is that because these are individual case files, it's quite difficult to establish any kind of collective learning going on. Although there are clearly refugees who are in the same boat, so to speak. The elderly Russians who are in China and want to get to Western Europe to an old people's home, for example. And then there are refugee students. So there's a kind of specific learning that refugees want to be able to undertake and want UNHCR's assistance with. But I also wanted to say that in terms of the surprises that come out of this material, you will have read, surely in the last few days, of the award of the Nobel Prize for Literature to Abdulrazak Gurnah, who now works and teaches in the UK, a writer, the novelist. And Gurnah doesn't figure in these case files, I should hasten to add, but he did flee from Zanzibar at the age of about 20 in 1968, I think, at a time when Tanzania had become independent, when there was a revolution in Zanzibar, which had targeted families such as his, relatively privileged people. And the point I wish to make is that UNHCR was increasingly confronted in the late 60s by dozens and dozens of people such as this who wanted recognition or wanted financial assistance from UNHCR, which said that legally they cannot be considered as refugees. But they were nevertheless helped in many instances, partly because of family reunification cases, to get to the so-called trucial states, the states that now become part of, or became in 1971, the United Arab Emirates. And one of the case files that I've come across is, I think, very revealing in this regard. This is from somebody called Salim K, who wanted to get his relatives from Mombasa to join him in Oman. And this is what he writes in 1971. The well understood situation in Zanzibar hardly needs any telling. Tortures and misery experienced by people are beyond human endurance. And I think this stance is revealing, because remember what he says. He says, the well understood situation hardly needs any telling. So his claim for assistance is being made on the basis that we all know, we've all learned the terrible events in Zanzibar during the revolution. So it's a kind of claim of a kind of common knowledge that we all have. I don't need to tell you, UNHCR, because everybody knows what is going on. Sometimes, of course, when you look through these case files, what happens is that refugees say, I deserve your help because you've already helped me in the past, and I have shown myself to deserve the benefit of your assistance. I'll just give you one short example. Again, from 1968. This is another person from Zanzibar who tells UNHCR that the money that they granted him to help him, he used to buy premium bonds in the UK. So this is kind of, you buy a premium bond and it goes into a draw, prize draw, and you might get something in the lottery, so to speak, and you don't lose your stake. It's always there. And UNHCR, writes back to pat him on the back and says this was an intelligent and wise investment. So in a way, you could say that what Mohammed K has done here is to kind of play along with what's expected of him. He hasn't spent it on something useless or even something useful like a bicycle. He's become a kind of avid consumer of financial benefits. So let me then draw things to a close. And I'm going to do it in the classic way that one does this thing, by saying what I haven't done in this talk. Okay, so what have I not done, and what you might want to talk about? I haven't said anything. I don't think the word refugee camp has passed my lips until just now. But we can, of course, think of the refugee camp as a site of learning, not just about the restrictions that are imposed upon refugees, but about the opportunities for self-expression, for gaining new skills, for gaining new knowledge. I'm thinking of the fascinating work that's being done by scholars such as Mesna Kato and Anna Irfan on Palestinian refugees and refugee teachers in countries such as Lebanon after 1948. I'm thinking also about refugees whose learning is of a kind of entrepreneurial kind, where you don't just buy a premium bond, but you invest in a business. I've always been fascinated by what Peter Loizos said about refugees in Cyprus, who moved from the north of the divided island after 74 to the south, and who set up businesses. And they advertised their businesses as refugee kebab, refugee taxi service. So for them, you could, as it were, learn that the designation or the label of refugee could actually become a business opportunity. I haven't said anything about host societies, which is a major omission, but here it's about host societies that learn or express notions of difference, but also about the potential in some contexts for refugees to be regarded not with contempt, but with a degree of admiration. What can they teach us? Going back to Russia in 1916, you find examples of peasant societies in the depths of European Russia who say, actually, these refugees from the Baltic states can teach us a thing or two about how to farm or how to look after livestock. So refugees could be Kulturträger, as well as it were, objects of hostility. I haven't said anything about states really, but there's a whole discussion that we could have about states and what they learn, or more problematically, what they learn to get away with, particularly through asserting sovereignty or trying to establish controls of one kind or another. But I think the final point I wish to make is a different one. And that's about learning as a process. Learning what's at stake and for whom. We can think about what's at stake for privileged academics, amongst whom I include myself, or people who are starting out on an academic career and the learning that they undertake. And we can think about the learning that's done by officials or aid workers. But I think ultimately we really need to pay attention to refugees who are in a situation very often where they're taking life and death decisions and learning what's possible and what opportunities or possibilities are foreclosed. So I think the point on which I'd like to end is one in which one should think not just about scholarship, perhaps, but about the responsibilities of active citizenship towards refugees, of learning what's to be done as a privileged outsider or observer, what can be done as a citizen activist, or at least some kind of supporter of those who are otherwise stranded and abandoned. And perhaps the ultimate lesson of learning by doing is learning the significance of solidarity. Thank you.